Hi, and welcome to AmeriCorps' Cultural Learning Community, or CLC. I'm Nathaniel Benjamin, AmeriCorps' Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officer and sponsor of the CLC. The CLC was developed in partnership with all agency programs and directly supports AmeriCorps' goal to strengthen the foundation of DEIA in the workplace. The CLC is a 12-month learning series that has content on DEIA, culture, equal opportunity, and civil rights, and many of you all are invested stakeholders, and we thank you for your input. The CLC is designed as an asynchronous or synchronous resource available to the entire AmeriCorps community, which includes members, senior volunteers, grantees, and employees. But following this session, a recording will be available on the AmeriCorps YouTube channel. We value your feedback, so be sure to complete the poll at the end of today's session. Again, thank you, AmeriCorps community, for participating in the CLC. I believe you will find the sessions engaging, enlightening, and time well spent. I look forward to growing in the cultural learning community together.
Thank you, Nate. Hello, everyone. Thank you all for taking time out of your day to join AmeriCorps for our very first Cultural Learning Community session. As today's facilitator for this conversation about compassion fatigue and the road to compassion resilience, please let me introduce myself. My name is Amelia Ryba. I am one of the EEO specialists and the Disability Program Manager here at AmeriCorps. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and for a visual description, I'm a white woman with brownish red hair, wearing pink lipstick and a green shirt. I'm speaking with you all from the ancestral home of the Piscataway and Anacostan people. I'm excited to share this information with you all, so let's get started. We're going to go over goals and objectives, and then we're going to share some of the history about compassion fatigue. We're going to review some of the definitions. We're going to go over components of compassion fatigue, share with you the risk factors of developing compassion fatigue, touch on some research that's being done in this field. Then I want to be able to share with you all why understanding compassion fatigue can help. Then we're going to have an interactive group activity where the chat will be enabled and the Q&A box will be available to post questions. Then we are going to move from discussing compassion fatigue into moving to compassion resilience. Then we will have an open Q&A session where we will once again enable the chat and have the Q&A box available for questions. Then I'm going to share with you some resources that you can use yourself or share with others. And then, as mentioned already, we will have a poll available to complete at the end and some references that you can follow up on if you are interested. As mentioned, we'll be opening the chat during a couple times of this presentation, but I encourage you all to be reflective during the session. Please feel free to take notes, write down questions, and post questions in the Q&A box, and we will do our best to respond to them and answer questions now or after the presentation is complete. So before we move into the content, I do want to acknowledge a trigger and a content warning. Compassion fatigue and its components can bring up difficult emotions, and due to the nature of discussing trauma and traumatizing events, some topics, examples, and words can be triggering. Please feel free to take breaks as needed and come back when you are ready. So let's review the goal and objectives of this presentation. The goal is to support the AmeriCorps workforce, members, volunteers, grantees, partners, and the communities we serve and live in increasing their knowledge about compassion fatigue and compassion resilience. The objectives of this learning session is for participants to be able to define compassion fatigue, understand more about how to implement best practices to move from compassion fatigue towards compassion resilience, and how to build compassion resilience individually and in teams. So to get started, I want to just talk a little bit about the history of compassion fatigue, both the term and the concept. So although the concept is not new, the term compassion fatigue has only been used since 1992. The term was first used in research by researcher and nurse Carla Joinson. Carla described compassion fatigue as, quote, the emotional devastation and, quote, the loss of the ability to nurture that nurses were experiencing in the medical field. Then in 1995, Dr. Charles Figley, who is now the director of Tulane University's Traumatology Institute, built upon Carla Joynson's research and expanded this concept into all helping professions, not just in the medical field. Dr. Figley also further defined compassion fatigue as the, quote, cost of caring, and added, quote, compassion fatigue is the deep physical, emotional, and spiritual exhaustion that can result from working day to day in an intense caring environment. In addition to helping professions, research has also indicated that compassion fatigue can extend to people in all caregiving roles. So what is compassion fatigue, resilience, and satisfaction? Let's start with the root of these concepts, which is compassion. Compassion is the ability to empathize with someone who is suffering and feeling compelled to reduce the suffering. This is not the same concept as sympathy or feeling sorry for someone, but it's the ability to understand someone and wanting to find a way to help. Compassion fatigue is the emotional and physical exhaustion resulting from exposure to traumatized individuals over time. Compassion resilience is the ability to maintain physical, emotional, and mental well-being while responding compassionately to the suffering of others. And finally, compassion satisfaction is the sense of fulfillment you feel for the work you do. Now that we understand the definitions, let's break down the concepts of compassion fatigue. When we talk about compassion fatigue, we often hear the terms burnout or vicarious trauma, and usually people use these terms interchangeably. And while they fall under the same umbrella that makes up compassion fatigue, each experience is different. Burnout is the general feeling of physical, mental, and emotional stress that one can feel in the workplace or in life in general. Burnout is the gradual buildup of feeling of hopelessness and believing your work doesn't make a difference, even if that's not true. Secondary trauma, known as secondary trauma, traumatic stress, typically occurs immediately after being exposed to another person's traumatic experience. The final component is vicarious trauma, which is the gradual shift in someone's worldview due to the repeated exposure of traumatic experiences of others over time. These components can exist independently of each other, but if someone is experiencing pervasive, repeated exposure to traumatic events and/or other people's trauma, combined with the feeling of hopelessness, these components can overlap and make up the experience of compassion fatigue. So what are the risk factors for compassion fatigue or developing compassion fatigue? I want to share a diagram that displays the risk factors for developing compassion fatigue. Individuals' personal experiences determine if these are risk factors to developing compassion fatigue or the components as we just reviewed in the previous slide. One of these components or risk factors is personal history of trauma. Has an individual experienced traumatic situations throughout their life? Have they received the emotional support they need to move through past traumas? Next is countertransference, which is usually referenced in the therapeutic setting, but can apply to anyone working or volunteering in a helping field. Another risk factor is the inexperience of working with trauma, meaning if someone does not feel that they have the education or resources to support themselves or their teams during and post a traumatic experience. Also, a person's level of ability to connect with others and understand another person's perspective could be either a protective factor, which we'll discuss later, or a risk factor. Finally, the degree of exposure. As stated already, some people can experience secondary trauma, which is usually sudden, but also tends to be temporary in nature. But repeated exposure to traumatic situations over time can significantly increase one's chances of developing compassion fatigue. So now that we've seen a visual of the risk factors that can contribute to someone developing compassion fatigue, I want to review a little bit about what some potential signs and symptoms could look or feel like. This is not an exhaustive list, and any individual does not have to have all of these symptoms at once to be considered a person experiencing compassion fatigue. But these are common signs and symptoms that have been identified both through self-reporting and through research. Compassion fatigue is not a medical condition or diagnosis, but the effects of compassion fatigue may exacerbate underlying conditions. So I just want to go through some of these potential signs and symptoms in each of the columns really quickly. So for physical, you may be experiencing headaches, migraines, you could be experiencing digestive problems, sleep disturbances, or even cardiac symptoms like tightness in the chest or rapid heart rate. For emotional symptoms, you could be experiencing frequent mood swings, excessive use of substances, maybe you're seeing increased symptoms of depression or anxiety, and you may be also experiencing irritability, oversensitivity, or anger and resentment. And in the work-related column, you may notice that you or other people around you that may be experiencing compassion fatigue are starting to use more sick days. They're starting to use time off more or calling out at the last minute more frequently. You may experience kind of that feeling of dread or avoidance when going into work or knowing you have to go into work on a certain day. And you may start to feel less compassion. You may start to feel the reduced ability to feel empathy and wanting to help people, and a lack of overall joyfulness in the work that you do or in the volunteer work that you do. So what does the research say? This is not an exhaustive list of research or data, but these are points I did want to highlight with you all today. Compassion fatigue has been heavily researched since 1992, and in this research, patterns have emerged that can help us understand how compassion fatigue shows up. Research has been expanded to all helping professions, as mentioned earlier, and in caregiving roles, both caring for older family members or siblings or cousins or being a parent. And this can help us learn how to make internal and systemic changes to reduce the chances of developing compassion fatigue, both individually, in families, and in teams. So as the research says, more than 70% of social workers experience some level of compassion fatigue. 71% of family caregivers experience high levels of caregiver burden, stress, and other experiences. And as many as 59.5% experience signs of burnout or compassion fatigue. Only 28% of people who are working in a helping career or volunteering in a helping career have received some form of specialized trauma training. And the final point I want to highlight with you all today is 81% of people and workers who suffer from compassion fatigue are all women. These research points are only a snapshot of what has been captured so far, and research is continuing in these fields of both compassion fatigue and stress. It's much more common than we may realize, and in knowing this, we can normalize conversations on how we shift from developing compassion fatigue to developing compassion resilience and compassion satisfaction. So how can compassion fatigue affect work? Understanding all of the components of compassion fatigue can present in all areas of life, but I want to highlight how compassion fatigue could affect the workplace and volunteer spaces. Think about times where you've tried to show up to work or to volunteer and you haven't been feeling well, or you're overly tired, or you're grieving a loss, or you're overwhelmed with life in general. Think about how all those things made you feel and how you felt when you were trying to work and volunteer. It could be hard to focus, and you may start to become forgetful. We may become more irritable, more impatient, and we may not be able to empathize with other people's stress with compassion due to our own feelings and experiences. Think about how this affects our ability to complete our work, how we lead teams, and how we disconnect from work if we're even disconnecting from work at all. If we're consistently showing up to work when our mental, physical, and emotional health are repeatedly exposed to trauma, it can affect our ability to show up and build genuine relationships. There can be a sense of guilt because we feel less passion for the work we do, or we know we're not working at the capacity that we know we can and we're used to be able to work in before. And it also feels devastating when you are feeling like your efforts don't matter and that you feel like the work you do isn't making a difference, even if the opposite is true and everything you're doing really does matter and does make a difference. The presentation of compassion fatigue can also both affect personal and professional relationships. In relation to our work, when employers are not taking care of their employees, it can affect our customers and the communities we serve. It can do this because people may feel unsafe if the environment is chaotic or tense, which affects trust building. And if people see employees, members, or volunteers being treated a certain way, or if their behavior is making them feel uncomfortable, then they are going to be uncomfortable coming to the places where we are supposed to be supporting and helping them. In addition, Employees experiencing compassion fatigue may become irritable and not be able to feel compassion with the people they're actually there to try to help, which can affect service delivery and then in turn affects program outcomes. Finally, this can also affect retention because people may feel underappreciated, overworked, and they could be experiencing health issues if they're continuously exposed to trauma without support. Being able to recognize and identify these potential effects of how compassion fatigue shows up in ourselves and in our teams is critical to being able to move forward to ensure the people we do work with and the people we support are all respected. So now that I've shared some history, defined terms, and shared how compassion fatigue and its components may show up in the workplace, the question I want to ask you all today is, who cares for the caregivers? This is a question initially posed by Dr. Figley and has continued to be posed with other people who research compassion fatigue and stress. As people who choose service, whether we work in service or we are in the military or we're a family caregiver, a parent, or we're volunteering, experiencing compassion fatigue can be hard to face. People may think, but I went to school for this. I should know better. Or I'm privileged. I'm not allowed to feel like this. Or people may start to feel worried about themselves because they don't feel like themselves anymore. Communities we serve may be coming to us wherever we work or volunteer during the most difficult time in their lives, and we are expected to be beacons of calm, support, and hope. But we are people too. We and our colleagues and our whole people outside of our roles. And it's important to remember when we ask, who cares for us? I want to connect this question to why it's important to learn about compassion fatigue, not just here at AmeriCorps, but for everyone. And I just want to pause for a quick moment. As a reminder, we do have a Q&A session at the end, and we are going to have an interactive activity. So please don't hesitate to ask questions, and you can put them in the Q&A box and continue to take notes and write down reflections or thoughts you may be having. So when we get to these interactive parts, you can share them in the chat box and in the Q&A box too. Why does this apply to AmeriCorps employees, members, volunteers, grantees, and beyond? AmeriCorps is a federal agency rooted in national service, which is about meeting people where they're at sometimes the most difficult time in their lives. AmeriCorps works directly with and also may be a part of underserved communities where, due to many factors, trauma and traumatic experiences may be present, including the presence of generational trauma. Part of our programming includes FEMA Corps, Disaster Cadre, members, volunteers, and Public Health AmeriCorps, who directly work in communities after natural disasters and either during or post a health crisis. So I want to continue from the previous slide of why does this apply to AmeriCorps employees, members, volunteers, and grantees, and everyone. We should care about the risk of compassion fatigue and developing it because we cannot implement our pillars here at AmeriCorps of unite, strengthen, impact, and lead if we are not being honest about the difficult experiences employees, members, volunteers, grantees, and the communities we serve are facing. In addition, in alignment with AmeriCorps Strategic Plan Goal 5, we're working to become one of the best and most equitable places to work in the federal government. This means we meet people where they're at by providing transparency about resources, benefits, and education that we can utilize both at work and outside of work, and volunteering. We want to be part of the solution the best we can. As we continue to work towards this goal, we want to provide the tools to inspire others on how they can reimagine themselves and their teams to be able to be their best selves for themselves, each other, for the communities we support, and for everyone that you interact with on a daily basis. We hope that we can model this support to our grantees and partners too. So next we're going to have a group activity. So we're going to open up the chat box, and I hope people have been putting questions in the Q&A box. So what we're going to do is watch 2 clips from YouTube that show both a discussion and examples of compassion fatigue. So please be ready to share your thoughts and experiences, but please only share what you are comfortable sharing. So once we watch both clips, we'll have a group discussion via chat, and I also have some questions to consider once we're done viewing the clips. So just a quick, before we play the videos, I just want to give you a quick highlight of what the videos are. So one clip is from ER, which I will take responsibility for. I am on an ER rewatch kick, so this is part of my inspiration of finding this video. But this clip is going to show part of the scene from season 1, episode 21, which is called House of Cards, where a doctor named Deb almost killed a patient, and then one of her colleagues comes to her later in the episode and asking her what she did, why she left, and what's happening. And then the other clip is from someone who is currently in the medical field and shares their personal experience with compassion fatigue while they were working. So if we can get started with watching the clips, that would be great.
Let's go to the kitchen. I really didn't care about the patient. I just wanted the procedure.
By tomorrow, everybody will forget.
I won't. I'm quitting.
You can't quit.
Sure I can.
Deb, listen. You're smart, and you learn fast.
What's that got to do with taking care of people?
You're gonna be a great doctor.
I don't really like it. No, that's not completely true. I like the science of it. But the patients, the sickness, sometimes it almost scares me.
Scared the hell out of me. When I was a kid, my older brother was really sick, in and out of the hospital. But when I saw how the doctors treated him and how they treated me, I knew that this was what I wanted to do.
See, that's the difference, John. You think about treating patients. You take the time to talk to them. You listen to them. You care.
So what are you gonna do?
Join the party. My parents' wedding anniversary. I'll wait to tell my folks afterwards. Mother will throw up. Should be fun. Thanks.
Amelia, are we ready to play the next video clip?
Yes, we are. Thank you. Sorry. I love ER. It's such a good show.
I couldn't believe I went from an excited, idealistic nurse to cynical and jaded. It was hard for me to believe that I had become so mean. My story of how I got into the healthcare field is probably similar to a lot of medical professionals. I wanted to help people in their greatest time of need. I wanted to contribute to humanity and comfort the sick. As a brand new graduate from nursing school, I got a job in a really busy ER. The hours were long, the paperwork was overwhelming, and the patient load was barely manageable. Wow, right? The stress and anxiety of the environment began to chip away at the foundation of my core values of care and compassion. It didn't really hit me until about a year into my new job when a patient was brought into one of my rooms from an ambulance. I remember the day really clearly. It was so stressful. Car accidents, heart attacks, those were all the norm for the day. So as the ambulance crew dropped off the patient, I began to ask him the routine triage questions. I got his name, age, then I started asking about his sickness. The man said he wasn't going to tell me anymore until I got him something to drink. I told the guy, I will get you a drink a little later after I get you checked in and the doctor sees you. The man kept asking me for some drinks and I said no, and he said yes, and the volley went back and forth for a while. Finally, I said, you know what? I will get you your drinks. At that point, I went to the hospital fridge and got about 30 little drinks and dropped them on his bed and said, "Here are your drinks. Now will you tell me what's going on with you?" At that point, the man cussed me out and threatened to kill me and then left the ER. Maybe you're thinking, I may have had good reason to do what I did and that it wasn't so bad. At the time, I felt justified in my reaction. However, my boss did not agree with me. And in retrospect, I've come to agree that it wasn't a good move on my part. It was, however, a very telling reaction. I realized that my heart had grown bitter and that bitterness was manifesting itself outwardly and infecting myself and directly on the patients. Unfortunately, this reaction to that man wasn't the last time my compassion fatigue manifested itself. Over the course of my 10+ years in the nursing field, I have treated patients and those closest to me in less than honorable ways because I had a serious case of compassion fatigue.
All right. Well, thank you, everybody. I do apologize. I did see a little bit in the chat that people were having some screen issues or echo issues, so I do apologize for that. I just want to so I'll give another quick synopsis just in case there were difficulty viewing the video. So in the first clip as mentioned, earlier in the clip, which I decided not to show today, there was a pretty graphic medical scene where Deb almost seriously injured, if not almost killed a patient. And then she was having a conversation with her colleague about why she quit and how she was loving the science of it more than actually helping people. And then in the second clip that we viewed, there was a person who was a nurse and sharing his experiences and how for him, a lot of anger and resentment was coming up as his compassion fatigue was manifesting. So if we could move to the next slide. I encourage you all again to continue to ask questions in the Q&A box and engaging in the chat. And my wonderful colleague, Stedman, is going to be helping me kind of go through the chat to make sure we can kind of get to everybody as much as we can. But as we're doing that, I want to ask some questions for you all to consider. So how did the viewed scenes we watched make you feel? What signs or symptoms of potential compassion fatigue presented in these examples? Was anything in the scenes we watched relatable to your experiences? If so, which parts were relatable? And the last question I want to ask to consider is, how do you think management could have supported the characters in their respective situations? I'm seeing some things in the chat as well as I think my mom experienced this growing up, taking care of my dad. I think I experienced this as well. People were saying how, wow, I see myself in these clips, or this is why I needed to take a break from teaching. So again, compassion fatigue doesn't just show up in the medical field. I know the clips showed they were in the medical field, but they do show up in so many types of helping professions. In my second year, oh, the chat's going so fast. So if I miss any of your comments, I apologize. I'm not intentionally trying to skip over you. But someone says management could have given better support. Someone says, I don't think people should have to work every day. Compassion fatigue not only happens to those who are work as professionals, it shows up with homes, especially with mothers. Yeah, exactly. It's not just care. When I mention caregivers, it's not just people who may be taking care of family members, but it's parents. Parenting is a full-time job. And a lot of times parents also are working. And there may be parents who are also teachers, who are in helping professions like in the medical field, law enforcement, or they're serving or in the military. So there's a lot of connections with that. Absolutely agree. Asking for help is a sign of strength. I'm currently experiencing underlying health systems due to caring for others in the community. It's very real. Relatable signs: guilt, irritability, second guessing their purpose, enough support from family and friends to step in. And we're going to talk about these points later as well, but it is important. And a lot of times I think part of why compassion fatigue can develop is because people are scared to ask for help. either at work or outside of work. So I saw a comment earlier in the chat where someone was mentioning social support, and we are going to talk about that later because you are right. Oh, someone said their pastor experienced this too. I was shocked. As a manager, I really need to be aware of where my team is at. I need to be ready to support and walk and talk with them, talk through their feelings. Well, kudos to you for having that moment of realization and recognition. That's fantastic. Someone mentioned in the chat, thank you for this. I am now also realizing I'm going through compassion fatigue. Hey, so, sometimes you watch something or you're in a training or you have a moment and you realize like, oh, this is happening to me. This is my experience. It is hard to give someone support when you're struggling. Not feeling like you're doing enough. When you feel like you can do better, it creates a feeling I need to do more versus I have done enough and it's okay. You cannot help your bucket if someone is empty. You cannot help someone if your bucket is empty. I may have read that wrong. Even just in team check-ins can help relieve some of the stress and remind that we're not alone in this feeling. That's correct. Signs: feeling apathetic, wanting to run away or quit suddenly, wanting to make big sudden changes without little thought, or extra sensitive for me. A lot of people are saying a very similar phrase, which is you can't pour from an empty cup. You can't help others if you're not doing good. Yes, exactly. Having management acknowledge that something is stressful is validating. And sometimes people just want to be heard. They just want to be heard and they just want to know that someone, especially in management, hears them and empathizes with them. And that alone is enough to help inspire problem solving. And how do we go from point A to point K? Not even B. Let's skip over some of the other ones, but let's go to a different letter. So thank you all so much for engaging in the chat and sharing your thoughts and feelings. And I've seen some posts in the chat already that are very vulnerable. So I just thank you all for being comfortable enough to share that with us. So again, sorry that I couldn't get to all of them. Sometimes the chat box scrolls up pretty fast and I don't have a chance to like catch it. So I just want to thank you all so much for being engaging. And I hope that the clips, again, I apologize for the clips, but I hope that it sounds like some people did see themselves. Allowing your fatigue can cause you to become a mean or unkind version on yourself and can make you feel worse without receiving help. Absolutely. Someone said, my background is in psychology and social behavior, so having compassion for my team is always top of mind. I encourage my volunteers to share if they need support. I'm also vocal about sharing if I need support from my supervisor, leading by example. I am so happy to hear that. And again, we are going to touch on that later. So I'm so glad to hear that people are already leading by example. Well, fantastic. Thank you all again for sharing everything. We are going to move on to the next part of this conversation. And we are going to close the chat, but we're going to reopen it at the end when we do a Q&A session. So please continue to reflect, post questions in the Q&A box, and then we'll re-engage in the chat at the end of this presentation. So we've been reviewing the history, the components, and the manifestations of compassion fatigue. We viewed examples in the media of how compassion fatigue could look, and we have connected them to our own experiences. And as we saw in the chat, some people were like, oh, I think I'm feeling this now, or wow, I'm realizing that this is something my mom was experiencing growing up, and it's connecting some dots for people. So I'm really glad that this is helping. So now we're going to shift from experiencing compassion fatigue towards developing compassion resilience. How do we get there? Well, some of you are already doing it, and I'm so happy to hear that, but we're going to go into it a little bit more. The first step is to recognize what needs to be changed. Once we accept what's happening in fatigue, we can move towards developing resilience. We can learn to identify stress and develop new coping skills, which can replace risk factors and turn them into protective factors. I want to acknowledge that changing environments where compassion resilience leads to compassion satisfaction and vice versa is not just down to one person. It's also recognizing the systemic barriers that affect the overall health and safety of an organization. So I just want to share this illustration really quick to demonstrate how developing compassion satisfaction is a protective factor of either reducing compassion fatigue or eliminating the chances of developing compassion fatigue. So developing compassion satisfaction leads to overall sustainable compassion resilience. So compassion satisfaction, as defined earlier, just as a quick reminder, is the sense of fulfillment you feel for the work you do. It can be a source of hope, strength, and ultimately resilience. So the question is like, okay, that's great. That sounds fantastic. I do want that. But how do we get there? How do we cultivate satisfaction to turn it into resilience? And how do we achieve this goal to reduce our chances of developing compassion fatigue? So I want to start this portion of the presentation with providing some best practices of how management and executive level leadership can build compassion resilience in teams. And I want to be able to share this for everybody, whether you're a current leader or you have goals to become a leader in the future. So the following points are suggestions based on researched best practices. The first point being creating space in one-on-one meetings and in team meetings for people to share challenges. This can help build trust with direct reports by allowing them to share all feelings, not just positive ones. This can also help you as a leader identify if an employee or a volunteer needs extra support. The next practice is cross-training teams. This ensures when people are out, they're not being contacted. Someone could be having a personal emergency, a health emergency, they could be in labor, or they could be on vacation. So if we're contacting people constantly and interrupting them, it's building and adding to their stress and resentment. And if you're putting things on hold until a person returns because no one else could do the work they do, it's only adding burden to yourself as a leader and adding burden to your team. So next is encouraging employees to seek out professional or peer mentorship. Sorry, we jumped ahead a little bit, but we're back. So peer mentorship and professional mentorship have both been shown to help people feel encouraged in their career development, which also improves career retention and employee retention. Peer support can also help colleagues and team members inspire each other to develop new approaches to problem solving. Another practice is to participate either yourself as a leader and also encouraging your employees to participate or even start an affinity group or an employee resource group. Be transparent when communicating directives, policies, and procedures. Partner with direct reports when sharing and addressing organizational concerns. When sharing training opportunities, consider recommending trainings that align with direct reports' passions, not just identified areas of growth. And a lot of times these are going to overlap. A lot of the times that people want to improve, like for example, if somebody wants to develop in leadership, that is not only an identified area of growth, but that is something that you also know they're passionate about. So it's kind of a win-win for everybody. Ensuring you're communicating out an organization's employee assistance program, civil rights policies such as requesting reasonable accommodations, reporting harassment or discrimination, and also communicating how leave policies work. Finally, it's respecting personal time. And I kind of addressed this earlier in the slide, but I just want to emphasize this point. This best practice also models that it's okay to take breaks. This also respects employees, members, and volunteers who are living their lives outside of the workplace. And I want to remind you all that these best practices aren't just for your direct reports and employees, but it's for you too. And it's for all leaders, because all employees at all levels deserve to be supported and to receive recognition. So what if I notice a colleague is displaying compassion fatigue? And although the title of the slide says colleague, this really does apply to everybody. So as we're processing this information, you may have thought, and you may have been inspired by some of the conversation we've been having is I've noticed someone is displaying some symptoms of compassion fatigue. So how can I help? I want to start with a reminder that if we notice changes in someone, we should respect personal boundaries and avoid making assumptions. If you have the capacity, you may ask someone, how can I help? If they share that they do want help, be honest about what you can help with and try not to overcommit yourself. Don't hesitate referring people to speak with you, your supervisor, or their supervisor. Contacting an organization's EAP, which is the Employee Assistance Program, or sharing community-based resources. Please do not attempt to diagnose or treat them. Even if you are a licensed medical practitioner, this person in this context is not your patient. Supporting others does not mean we take on their stress, because then it's only going to add to our own stress and could develop feelings of resentment and guilt if we take too much on. And I want to add a final note that's not on the slide, but I just want to say it out loud. If someone does disclose to you that they want to harm themselves or others, please do notify the appropriate mental health resources and/or emergency services that can provide them the health and safety support that they do need. So the last slide is, well, this is all well and good, but how do I start to develop compassion fatigue within myself? Or not compassion fatigue, but how do I start to develop compassion satisfaction within myself so I can develop compassion resilience that is sustainable over time? So I am going to go over all of these individually and try to give some examples, but I want to make sure I highlight that these are also research best practices, and I want to share them with you all because ultimately creating compassion resilience within ourselves is in our control. We cannot be of service to others until we create sustainable practices that prioritize our well-being. So the first part says core, and it's identifying the 4 core components of resilience, which is getting adequate sleep, good nutrition, regular physical exercise, and active relaxation. And active relaxation is maybe a new concept or term. It was for me when I was doing research for this. And essentially what it is it's going to be kind of reflected on other points on this slide, but it's a way to relax that is still engaging in an activity, either physically or cognitively. I think a good example of active relaxation is meditation or Tai Chi or learning a skill like knitting. So hydrate is the next point. So trying to limit the amount of sugary drinks, alcohol, and caffeine. The caffeine is hard for me, but it is an identified best practice to help over time build compassion resilience. Mindfulness. So practice being present. Meditation, breath work, calming sensory input, such as music, tactile, sense, or visual. And I do want to make a quick point on this point of mindfulness. So silent guided meditation is wonderful, but it is not always helpful for people, especially if people are neurodivergent. So trying other kinds of mindfulness activities that focus on sensory input could be an alternative to try if silent or guided meditation doesn't work for you. So collaboration, engaging with your colleagues to celebrate successes and address challenges as a group. This kind of goes back to the point that we've kind of discussed throughout this presentation and in the next point. You are not in this alone. I know we can feel like that sometimes, but you really are not alone. So don't feel scared to lean on trusted colleagues and trusted social support and friends to be able to celebrate and address issues. So social support, going right into the next point. And this should be listed first because in all research across the board, having a social network is the #1 protective factor of reducing stress, burnout, compassion fatigue, etc. Having a social network is one of the best ways to develop compassion resilience over time. And whether that social support is online or in person or a little bit of both, any type of social support you're getting is going to help you kind of get information out of your system, get validation in a healthy, supportive way, and also help inspire to challenge you to make changes in your life too, and just be supportive and help you decompress. So a hobby. So this is one of personally my favorite ones because I think hobbies are so important into being a human, and having a hobby that is different from the work that you do. So it helps you build a new skill set that is completely separate from the work you do day to day. Not only is helping you build your cognitive skills, but it can also help increase your social network. It is also can be a type of active relaxation depending on what the activity is. And it's just a fun way to help decompress and focus on something new to help build confidence and reduce stress over time. So the last point I do want to make is asking for help. Asking for help from your social network, from supervisors, from anybody that you think that can help support you is extremely important. But I do want to acknowledge that if you are experiencing persistent symptoms that inhibit your daily functioning for 30 days or longer, please consider reaching out to a licensed mental health professional that can help support you during this time and help you work through some very difficult feelings. So we are kind of almost at the end. I kind of can't believe it. And now we are going to open the chat back up. And I see there have been some questions posed in the Q&A chat or the Q&A box. So I am excited to open the chat back up and see what type of questions people have been asking throughout this presentation. I will do my best to answer these questions. If I don't have an answer for you right now, I will find a way to help get the answer to you in some way, shape, or form.
Am I coming in clear, Amy?
Oh, I can hear you now. My colleague
Okay.
Stedman Ware is going to be helping us with the Q&A session.
Here we are. Yes. So I've been taking a few questions, and I apologize in advance. I'm just gonna read out these questions. If I don't get to everyone's question, I've been kind of copying them down. So Amy, here we go. How do you rescue a person who is in the middle of fatigue but not aware?
That's a great question. So kind of back to the point where we were talking about if I'm noticing someone is experiencing compassion fatigue, what do I do to help? I challenge you to maybe reframe the thinking of rescuing anybody, because most people, we don't want to make assumptions that people want to be rescued. But I think it is really great that you do see someone that is suffering and you want to find a way to help reduce that suffering. So I think, again, based on the points kind of discussed just recently in the slide, I think asking someone for help is the first step you can go, and being very honest with yourself and the person and saying what you can help with, I think is extremely important, because you don't want to overcommit and you don't want to add to your own stress, but showing the person that you are there for them genuinely by asking them for help, being honest what you can help with, and then following up and getting any sort of resources to them, I think is really important. And we are going to share some resources after the presentation and at the end of this presentation that are community-based resources that you can share with anybody. If you're an AmeriCorps employee, it's a reminder about the EAP program and things like that. So there are some ways, but I think the most important thing for you is to be present, be genuine, and start by the simple question of asking, how can I help you?
Awesome. Thanks, Amy. So the next question is, can you expand more on countertransference and its relation to service?
Yes, that's a great question. Without going into too much detail, this actually happened to me. I'm not a social worker, and I am not a licensed medical or mental health provider, and this happened to me in the helping field. Countertransference is when we project our own unresolved trauma or our own stress onto a person that we are helping who may actually be triggering us, and we don't know that. So we hear countertransference in the therapeutic setting, like it's very common for therapists, licensed social workers, licensed professional counselors, but anyone who's like a case manager, an educator, or someone who is working directly one-on-one with people, that is what countertransference could look and feel like for someone, because they are being triggered by the person or the people they're helping without realizing they are projecting onto them. And it becomes kind of a cycle. I hope that answers your question.
So, Amy, this one is, this is a biggie. What is the difference between compassion fatigue and major depression? I think that's pretty multifaceted.
That is, and I don't know, that's a great question. These are all great questions, but I'm trying to think of how I can answer that, because I'm not a licensed mental health provider, but I think the difference between compassion fatigue and depression is, I think compassion fatigue can really exacerbate depression. So if you are someone who, whether you're diagnosed with depression or not yet, I think having the symptoms of compassion fatigue mimic depression. So I think over time, it does kind of sound and feel the same way. And people may be experiencing very severe symptoms of depression because they may not have been diagnosed yet, or because of the stresses they're feeling at work or volunteering and the repeated exposure to trauma. That is what is actually could be what's exacerbating their depression symptoms. Kind of to the last point, if you are experiencing symptoms that, whether it's depression or any sort of symptoms that are severe enough that they are inhibiting your daily functioning, I would definitely consider reaching out to a mental health provider that can help you maybe get the that's not the right word, but getting the diagnosis you need to get the support that you need. And in that support, you may realize, oh, some changes need to be made, because I think I also am dealing with compassion fatigue in the workplace or volunteering.
Absolutely, Amy. Thank you for that.
You're welcome.
Are there resources to provide trauma training for volunteers and project staff here at AmeriCorps?
So I'm going to say not yet, because I don't know what will happen in the future, but currently there's not trauma specific training. We are going to have a CLC course later this year that talks about trauma informed organization. More details will come out about that later this year, because that's not going to be until July. But I also want to share that in addition to resources that we're going to share with you all to either use for yourself or share with others, there's also a reference slide. And in those references, there's lots of great resources where you can, for example, like SAMHSA, the Traumatology Institute, they also may have trainings available for individuals or for teams or for organizations specific around trauma and how to use trauma-informed organization to improve an organization or a team.
Excellent, Amy. So there's a question about, is there a talk in the literature about environmental compassion fatigue?
I'm going to say yes. I think you have to, not you as the person asking the question, but we have to consider, especially when you're working in a field where you're exposed to natural disasters or effects of climate change, or you're working with people who are surviving these things, I think those can definitely develop into compassion fatigue, because it's not just the trauma of what people are experiencing, but it could be the overwhelming stress of what's happening in the environment around you. And if you are in an environment where you are not able to kind of develop the skills you need to develop resilience, like getting adequate rest, getting access to nutrition, adequate clean water, and other things that are kind of around in the environment, I think that could be exacerbating and developing compassion fatigue. I will admit that I think this is a fantastic question, and I just don't have a specific book or article that discusses compassion fatigue in the environment. but I would not, I'm sure there is literature out there. And if I can find any literature specifically, I will try to connect with the person who asked the question and share that out with you all.
Thank you, Amy. So we have a lot of questions about getting the slides of this PowerPoint. Will those be made available?
As far as I know, I don't know if the slides are going to be made available, but we are going to have a handout that is going to be shared. So the handout is going to be shared for everybody who registered and participated in today's conversation. And it's going to touch on some high points throughout the presentation, but also this presentation is recorded and it's going to be on the AmeriCorps YouTube channel. So if you are comfortable sharing this link or watching it again, then you are welcome to do that as well by getting the link from YouTube, which I believe will also be shared out kind of in a post-event email.
Absolutely. Thank you, Amy. I have one that's a little bit more, it's a little bit more lengthy, but I love these. It's situational. So I think it's very cool. So the needs are infinite, and it feels like what we can do is just a drop in the bucket. Does it make a difference at all? I'm an ED that's always reminding our volunteers that it matters from one person. So it's a good thing. But in reality, I have some doubts about it at times. Are there early signs of burnout?
This is a hard question to answer only because just like with any medical condition, symptoms may present differently in every single person. You know, we all have different experiences, different backgrounds, different coping mechanisms, and different personalities. So how burnout or compassion fatigue may manifest in ourselves is not going to look the same in two people. I would think, though, despite knowing that, some early signs in identifying burnout in any sort of direct report or volunteer or a colleague would just be, you notice maybe a shift in their personality. Maybe they were someone who was a bit more quiet or neutral or kind of a cheerful person. And if you start to notice that the conversation is shifting to more sad or negative topics, or maybe their body language is changing, or they're maybe talking back more or snapping at people more, or maybe they're more emotional than they usually are, or they're saying things and sharing things that they didn't before. I think those could be the best indicators that something may be going on. And again, back to the point of that we discussed earlier, please feel free to ask them if you can help, but be also honest about what you can help with, and then refer to them to the appropriate resources. And again, it's not to say that you shouldn't help anybody, of course, but it's just ensuring that you are supporting the person and being there for them, but also making sure you're okay as well. Because if you start taking on their stress or getting way too involved in some things, it could also start to negatively affect you. So I think the important thing is just identifying the concerns, and maybe if you were like in a leadership role, you know, developing a meeting where you have a conversation about celebrating wins, or even if it's a small win, or even if it's a win that's only specific to your team or one person. I think that's extremely important because it can help start to build morale a bit more and could shift conversations back to productive and supportive conversations.
Thank you, Amy. And I also want to point out, it looks like we have some individuals in the chat who are kind of responding to these questions. Maybe some of you are mental health professionals or have some experience in this field. Thank you so much for your input. And thank you for your openness and being willing to share your responses as it relates to this topic. So I just wanted to, shout out the individuals in the chat. And my apologies for not calling or copying the name with the question. So forgive me for that. We'll definitely try and do that next time around. Amy, I did want to point out the time. We have about 14 minutes left, but I'm seeing a lot of questions about burnout. Can you talk about the difference between burnout and compassion fatigue? And I know we talked a little bit about that, but I'd love to hear us kind of remark on that again. Sure.
So burnout is kind of the progressive it is a progressive feeling of feeling hopelessness at work and and usually it's the result of being overworked or being, experiencing unappreciation at work. So burnout is more of like kind of, I don't want to say the first step, but it is kind of the first kind of signs, and it starts to show over time. Compassion fatigue is kind of, I know I'm using my hands, but it is kind of an umbrella. So as we discussed the components earlier, burnout, vicarious trauma, and secondary trauma all kind of fit under this compassion fatigue bubble. So usually burnout is something that usually can be remediated if it is addressed, whereas compassion fatigue can be fixed and can be remediated through developing resilience and compassion satisfaction over time. But burnout specifically is kind of the beginning stages of, if this doesn't get fixed very quickly, we're going to start developing other components such as secondary trauma or vicarious trauma, and then overall the experience of compassion fatigue. I hope that answers the question.
Awesome. Thank you, Amy. Yes, I see a lot of people are concerned about, burnout and being able to tell the difference between the two and how to resolve it in different circumstances. Amy, is there somewhere where if individuals are unable to get their questions answered here today, is there somewhere they can reach out to after the presentation if they want to specifically have your response?
That's a good
Or
question. That's a good question. I suppose we could have them reach out to odeia@americorps.gov if people want to ask kind of follow-up questions. Sorry, I don't.
Yes,
Sorry, I don't have an email ready to go.
I'm sure that. So that if in the event that your questions are not answered, we certainly want to screen those and have those ready and available.
Sure. No, that's great. And plus that could give us some time to maybe give some more in-depth answers to your questions. And I also want to acknowledge if I'm not fully answering questions, again, you can reach out and we'll do our best to follow up and provide deeper answers, but also being able to go through some of the references and resources we're going to provide you all in the handout could be a great start, especially if this is a topic that you are really interested in learning more about, getting training in, and not just for the information, but it's like, yeah, I'm noticing burnout. I'm worried about compassion fatigue growing from the burnout in myself or on my team. So how do I get a training in place that can help myself and my team and my organization?
All right, Amy, would you mind taking maybe a couple more questions?
Sure.
Awesome. All right, so the question is, what if schedule plays into compassion fatigue? And that schedule isn't subject to change. I work full-time and I'm in grad school full-time, conducting my thesis. My compassion fatigue has put clients and patients before. I guess they're saying they put clients and patients before themselves. So yeah, how do we work with that? If the schedule, if what you're going through isn't subject to change anytime soon?
My immediate thought would be, because you mentioned grad school, if there's a way to have a conversation with your graduate advisor or professor about your schedule or about any sort of tips or techniques that they used or they have advised previous students to implement. I know it is challenging when you were in graduate school or medical school, law school, and also trying to balance the internships, the hours, and the work. So I don't have an immediate answer for that specific situation. And it's not that I don't want to answer it. I just don't want to give you incorrect information. So maybe that could be a question we follow up more in depth with at a later time, if that's okay.
Excellent. Thanks, Amy. And this was one that is particularly suited probably for your new role. How do we request reasonable accommodations to battle compassion fatigue?
That's a great question. So to learn more about how to request reasonable accommodations where you may be working, I would reach out to your organization, company, agencies, HR representative, EEO specialist, or disability program manager that manages the reasonable accommodation program. Because everything's connected to an overall like federal regulations and law, but every company and organization may have a specific process that they follow. I would consider reaching out to a licensed mental health professional and getting information about how they can support you in explaining how you can get a reasonable accommodation to support any sort of diagnoses that could be exacerbated by the compassion fatigue that you're experiencing. So meeting with someone who is a licensed medical professional, or a therapist or a psychologist, who could guide you through the process and be able to help supplement medical documentation to share to request the reasonable accommodation would be a great start.
Excellent. Thank you, Amy. I do want to allow you some time to kind of talk about some of the resources that were put into this presentation.
Sure.
And hopefully, if we have a few more questions, we may be able to take one or two more.
Okay, great. Thank you, Stedman. And thank you, everybody, for asking your questions. I'm sorry if I'm missing. I know I can see the chat ticking up really fast, and I'm so sorry I haven't been getting to the chat. I'm going to try to get to those hopefully later, and maybe response or any type of way I can. But thank you all for being so engaging and being vulnerable with us. So as Stedman said, I want to get to the last few slides really quick. So there are some resources that you can either use yourself or you can share with others. So here at AmeriCorps, we actually do have a ODEIA National Resource Guide. And although this is labeled as AmeriCorps, you are able to download it, and everything on this resource guide, except for the AmeriCorps specific employee assistance program, can be shared with anybody because these are national based resources. They're 24/7. They some have phone numbers, some are web-based, and some of them are identity or community specific that practice cultural awareness and competency in their support. So if you are an AmeriCorps employee, you can contact or research the AmeriCorps Employee Assistance Program, or wherever you work. If you are not an AmeriCorps employee, but you are joining us, we are so happy you're here. And you can contact or look into your organization or agency's Employee Assistance Program. If you are a VISTA member, there are VISTA member wellness resources. And I would also consider reaching out to your health insurance provider to learn what type of mental health benefits are available to you, because there's a lot of health and wellness programs where you can get free or discounted services, in addition to learning about how you can potentially connect to a mental health provider. And then if you are looking for that as well, there is this great resource that Stedman actually shared with us, which is called Psychology Today. And there is a function on there where you can customize therapists based on insurance or no insurance topics. If you are looking for a therapist who is a part of a specific community or background, you can customize for that. And they will help you look for therapists that accept your insurance, work with people who may not have insurance in your area. So in addition to the resources that you can use and share with others, this is the references slide. So everything is both on the resources and the references slides are linked. So all of these in blue are linked. You can click on these and it will take you straight to the website or a document that can support you. And I hope this is information that can help inspire you to continue to learn more about burnout or compassion fatigue, how to build compassion resilience within yourself and within your teams. And I hope and also looking for trainings that can help your organization, your team, and yourself with developing compassion resilience and addressing systemic and organizational concerns. So I just want to thank you all so much. This was our very first CLC session, so I'm so grateful for you all. I am so thankful that you were engaging in the chat, in the Q&A. And again, I hope I answered the questions I did my best, and I hope the answers were very fulfilling and helpful for you. And I just am so thankful. So thank you all for being a part of the AmeriCorps community. We hope that you join us in future CLC sessions that are coming up every month through the rest of this year. And as we're wrapping up, I ask you to take the next few minutes to respond to our poll. Your feedback will inform future cultural learning community events. So I thank you all so much, and I appreciate you all.
All right, we're at 100% completion of the poll. Are we all right to close and end the webinar?
Yes, we are. Thank you.